I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, in this video, I'm going to go ahead and talk about diseases in original Dungeons and Dragons, OD&D. This is a fantastic fantasy world, not the real world. There's no innuendos talking about how real medicine works. I really need to cover this early and quickly so that the algorithm AI overlord type stuff doesn't look at this and think I'm trying to give real life advice. This video is not on any sort of real world established or unestablished or any facts that are based in what would be considered real medicine. This is not medical advice. I am not speaking to, referring to, or conveying in any form or transferring information about real world diseases and how to treat them. There is no such thing as a cure disease spell. If anyone finds information they think relates to them, they should seek medical advice. Anyone suffering from the effects of what they think to be a disease they hear in this video should seek medical advice. In any reference, if you have a question about how to roll a d20, seek medical advice. That's a little bit of a joke, but not really. This is not a video talking about actual diseases. This is set in a fantastic world. Post 2020, I feel like I have to be that detailed when I say this. Now, let's dive more into this fantasy setting so we can talk about obscure fantasy realm stuff in a Dungeons and Dragons game. Okay? Great. Now that maybe I've set the AI overlords at ease a little bit, I hope to split this video up into 3 different parts. First, we're going to talk about the diseases themselves and the way basically Dave Arneson wrote them, basing them off of a real disease, but then putting game mechanics in there for what would happen. I do not believe the information, the death rates, and this type of stuff is designed to be accurate. I believe they to be an abstract representation of what he wanted in the game as far as difficulty. My recommendation at the end of the video will also be to play with these numbers and make that way. Now, Dave Arneson's world was Blackmoor. And in Blackmoor, he wrote that more people have died from sickness and disease than from war. It continues to say that diseases and sicknesses do not care what level you are or how many hit points you have, or even the highest level NPC or PC in the game. All of these can be struck down by disease, regardless of their alignment and who they're allied with. Now, I would disagree in general with that statement, and I would say that certainly hit points do help. Yes, I understand that even the mighty can fall to disease and sickness, and I like the fact that that's there. However, you are scaling difficulty in a way that the group may not want. And if you're playing a game where this is a thing you want to do, then please, by all means, venture forth and learn about these diseases that will definitely shape the world around you. And if you're trying to play a little bit more realistic, would actually be there. There are some places that are going to be more logical to find diseases and sickness. Some place like a swamp, a siege, overcrowded cities often will foster diseases because of the proximity to other people, the temperature, the lack of care you're able to give yourself, the lack of clean water, for example, purified, sanitized situations. Those things tend to be huge factors in disease. And if you're trying to add some realism to your game, as I've already stated a few times, this might be the way to make a swamp different. However, everyone's playstyle might be different. Now, there's a disease table or chart, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to go ahead and scroll that across. This is on page 53 of my PDF. It has a lot of information that is not specific in disease description. It's more of a reference. A lot of things are used to represent other diseases. I'm going to talk about my full opinion on this later, but I would say that there's probably a better way of referencing this outside of a detached chart where multiple diseases go to the same disease. However, for those who want to know what ails them, this video is going to be designed to really bring that grit and grime, that Conan-like world, maybe a sword and sorcery type of thing to your world. Let's go ahead and start with a common one, maybe what they call grippe. I don't know. It's basically a cold, a flu. I like having names that might be in other languages, but I'd almost prefer these names to be made up as not real, so that if you ever were to search this on the internet, you would find the specifics to that spell or that disease, not like the real world stuff. I think that'd be nice. Anyways, I digress. So grippe, whatever you want to call it, is a cold, flu-like, maybe belly ache type of thing, fairly minor. The book suggests that an anti-cleric can cast reverse of cure wounds or a bless spell to cause this effect. I think that makes a lot of sense. Going through this section, I found a lot of inferences where spells can be used differently, and how different monsters actually would do things. I'm going to get to one that they don't even cover in their own books in this version, but in later versions, they would actually incorporate that. But I'll save that one for later. The bubonic plague, I'm not going to say or put text up of what actual plague that is. Just saying that far is enough to maybe get me under the ire of a certain A and I, shall we say, and I don't want to necessarily do that. That is not the intent of this. If the victim survives, there's still a 10% chance they will remain incapacitated. There's a 5% chance that the victim will be considered to be a carrier, which means they have no visible signs. They become immune to the disease, but they give it out to other people. This does not really go into how and what that means or what the infectious rate is. That might be on the card, but then you have to flip back and forth. You're going to run into this a few times. That's enough about this one, though. Dysentery. Outside of the Oregon Trail, this is actually a very dangerous thing. In the Oregon Trail, it actually outright killed you, but that's a whole different thing. In most D&D games, I think you'd have a hard time dying from this. But in the right world where you're tracking how much water you carry, how far you're traveling, this thing here actually could become very dangerous in this simulator-like world. A persistent world, you could have serious problems. This is usually caused by bad food and water. It could also be caused by conditions like traveling through a swamp, rancid conditions in some way. Cholera is also transmitted in many ways similar to what you would find in like a swamp in rancid conditions. It's transmitted by flies, sometimes by hogs specifically, but there are those who are already infected with it that could then pass it on through food and water that have been exposed already. These are often attributed to swamps, overpopulation, and poor conditions likely to find. When the target is exposed, they have a 60% chance to get the disease. This also means that someone may never catch the disease, and up to 25 to 35% of those who have it die from it, and the remaining population may never contract the disease at all, ever. Now, what you'll notice about this one from the other ones I have is there's a lot of percentiles, and this can get a little confusing because they never clearly state before, during, after transmission rates exactly the same in any one of these diseases. However, this is a seedbed of ideas to pull from, which is the overall good arc I'm going to talk about in this part of the book. Next, we have malaria. This is found in tropical or subtropical and temperate areas. This book doesn't cover it extremely well. It seems that there are rare tree barks that can be made in a fantasy world, i.e. some sort of fictional ointment that has like a 90% chance to cure this disease. While this is still an extremely rare disease, this bark seems to be relished by both blink dogs and displacer beasts, causing apparently hatred for each other, and they will fight upon sight. Who knew there was beef between dogs and cats in Dungeons and Dragons? That's kind of crazy. When I looked into what these creatures say specifically, I found that they are found on the 4th level of dungeons. Interesting. Which would normally limit trees even to be considered. However, maybe these trees are so rare because that depth or whatever, the level of the dungeon, I guess, may have something to do with these rare trees. I'm not 100% sure. They do not go into it, but I do feel like this could be expanded on in a way that would create a good world building opportunity. Next one is another one of these smallpox type of things. So the death rate for this is 30% of those who are infected. It's an extremely infectious disease with 70 to 90% of those exposed catching it. And with those who are infected taking nearly a year to recover, often with skin discoloration and severe pockmarks. It will cause permanent loss of charisma, and a D6 plus 1 pockmarks will never go away. Now, the application of losing charisma, I think really should fall more on the appearance side versus the loyalty side, just because you have a really bad, severe case of chickenpox that never tends to go away, and it made you tougher because of it. I don't think necessarily takes away from your ability to lead people. Also, a D6 plus 1 really isn't that many pockmarks on the whole body, and we don't know where they're at. You may not see any of them ever. As Doc Holliday would tell you, though, tuberculosis requires complete rest when you're dealing with tuberculosis. Outside of course, of a cure disease spell, there's a 10% chance of catching it if you're in contact with someone who already has it. This can be found in dark, underground, and damp and overcrowded areas, though it is only a 2% chance in those locations to catch it generally. Death rates are pretty incredible at 80% for those who cannot rest and 40% for those who can, literally doubling the chance to survive the disease by taking a long rest, probably years if you were ever to be that lucky. Survivors are not out of the woods either, as they have a 45% chance of losing a D3 points of constitution, which is pretty incredible. And I think that maybe that's how death should actually occur. You just keep losing a D3 until you die, and your body can't sustain itself. That makes sense to me. Typhus is a type of parasite that is a disease type thing, which is often found during wars and overcrowded where you have food storages. You'll notice a lot of repeating words here. That often deals a lot with cleanliness and that is not being maintained, like decaying bodies and these type of things. The death rate of this is only 25% with a 10% chance of relapsing every D2 plus 2 years. Wow. And you check that every 5 years, making this a lingering a lingering disease that's harder to deal with. Typhoid fever was common among soldiers in densely populated areas, trying to work on my wording here so it doesn't sound exactly the same, where food and water are not properly stored and might get contaminated. There's a 40% chance that if you're in this area that you will get infected by someone who has it, and there's a 10% chance that someone will not show symptoms, therefore be a carrier. There's a 40% chance that without treatment you will die, and due to the complications, you have a 10 to 2% with treatments that you will still die. Why there's a variance, I don't know. They don't necessarily explain it. However, there is one. A referee could probably look into more of the details and understand why there's such a large range from like removing a person from the location to a dry area, getting them medical help as needed probably would reduce your rate of dying even with treatment. Next up, we're going to talk about advanced leprosy. All mummies get this disease. It can be transmitted through damage. It also causes wounds to take 10 times as long to heal. I would say being in the general environment with a mummy probably exposes you to it in a way. So if you were to hug a mummy, if you were to lay in a mummy's coffin for a period of time, I think that'd be a problem for you. Even a cure disease does not completely remove it. It only changes it to 1/2. So 5 times as long to heal until the disease is finished. If there is no cure disease spell cast on the target within 3 days, there's a 95% chance of death. Now, I don't know who's playing these odds, but don't go to Vegas. You have a 2% per day, which means apparently you check every day, that it's going to lower your chance of death every day. So you're going to go from 95 to 93 to 91 to 81, and eventually maybe you just survive. That's not how I know that disease to work. This is a mechanic device of this disease. And those who die from this disease cannot be brought back at all. Now, I personally disagree with that part and think there is a way this could happen. It's not going to be good, but there's a way this could happen. For example, if you were to have the proper support, whether provided for you because of your desire or against your will of the chaotic alignment, you could do a ritual to create a mummy and literally turn a person who dies of mummy rot or this advanced leprosy into a mummy themselves. That's a thought. I don't know. If you want to have it either way, I don't think that's bad. I just think it's an interesting way to have mummies enter the game. And any player who wants to do it, because it will happen, will instantly become an NPC in the world and lose control of their character. Hurrah! Congratulations. So there's an issue with mummies as the primary source of the disease. It doesn't actually say that this is mummy rot. And when you go to the mummy section in book 2, it doesn't describe what the mummy actually does. It does have some further clarification when you go to the table and you use all 3 parts and books, 2 books together to get this clarified, but they didn't clarify it further in the Blackmoor book, sadly. My guess is that once the disease is treated, it doesn't exactly go away, but it starts to clear up, ignoring some of the effects. I could see having it go away a little bit more every time you cast the cure disease up to the hit dice of the creature who gave you the mummy rot. Therefore, a 5 hit dice mummy, you cast it 5 times and you've perfectly cleared up that. I could also see that a 3-day mechanic, you do it once and then you do it again in 3 days, or you do a remove curse and that would remove it. I think all 3 of those really work well. Now, not to be yellow and run away from these things, let's go ahead and talk about yellow fever. This is carried by mosquitoes. They're often found, but not limited to, jungles and swamps. I would say you could also find these in probably plains and that type of stuff in certain months especially. You probably wouldn't find them in deserts and mountains because of the dryness of the air and the fact there's no water for them to live in, and they don't live a terribly long time anyways. Once someone gets it, they have a 20% chance to spread to other people. So in those situations, it could be spread. There's a 10% chance for those who contract it, they will fall into a coma, and a 50% chance that they will ever wake up from that coma. The good news is, though, if you survive it, you now have immunity. Next up is the crud. This is a type of a nondescript rash or athlete's foot, jungle rot, maybe some sort of damp fungal thing like ringworm maybe. That is sort of a catch-all for all things that irritate and annoy, and can maybe be cleaned up with washing of the clothes and talcum powder. Yes, they actually reference talcum powder in Supplement II Blackmoor. It is magnified by weather, hot weather specifically, sweating and irritation from sand and grit not being able to dry out. This crud is not something you can give to anyone else, nor can you gain any sort of immunity to it. This is kind of a thing you might gain some tolerance to, but it probably would grind on you over time. The reason why something like this happens, in my opinion, is like the answer for why the paladin's running around in plate mail and then tries to sleep in his plate mail. This would probably give you crud, for example. Last but not least, we have spotted fever. Now, the spotted fever is transmitted by giant ticks. There's an 80% chance that the tick will have it. The fatality rate is not listed specifically, and the chance, at least in the description, and there is a chance of insanity if the victim survives. Once a character has been exposed, they will build up an immunity to it, though. So when I went deeper into look into like the giant tick, I found it in Supplement 1, so a completely different book. They found it necessary to talk about cure disease in that specific monster description. As they say, it will prove fatal in 2d4 days. By checking out the monster description, I believe that it kills 100% of the people in that amount of time if it's not cured. And then looking at it, it looks like the actual percent chance of going crazy is 5%. There are several forms of diseases in this book that are covered by unnamed statistics and like and they share the stats of the other diseases. Things like giant leeches, as long as it remains attached, it's losing 1 level a turn. They can be removed by killing it, but the victim then has to have a cure disease cast on them, or they will die within a month. That is not covered in there. There's also the exact opposite covered in Blackmoor, and one could almost list it as a magical item, but I don't believe it's actually magic doing this. I believe this is technology. Blackmoor has some more sci-fi elements to it, shall we say, and in this one they have what they call a med kit. Med kits can produce vaccines for preventive and communicative diseases. This can be found in Supplement Blackmoor 2, as I've said, and it is not a small or very medieval type of thing. It's actually a cube approximately 10 feet per side that is easily moved with an anti-gravity field is turned on. What the heck? That is not in my historical D&D game. So I've been talking about diseases, specifics, and their specifics, and some of the things that the Blackmoor book has been going over for a while. Now I want to talk a little bit more about how they make their way into our heroic adventurers' lives. The first part of this has been recapped a dozen times so far probably, but diseases like warm, moist, dark areas, in general, that's in the real world too. They do not like the sun. They do not favor dry spots in most situations. However, we are playing in a fantasy world, so those type of things can exist too. There are also fantastic creatures that carry diseases that should not be. This is Editor Zone. I noticed that there is one part I missed completely, which is kind of silly and ironic. There is literally the section on lycanthropes, one of the major disease-carrying creatures in original Dungeons & Dragons, any version of Dungeons & Dragons. So let me go ahead and break into this a little bit. So the original 1974 book has 3 types that are evil and 1 type that's good. You can see the one pink here that is good or neutralish, and that is the werebear. The other 3 are considered to be evil, chaotic creatures. Now, there is one that comes out later called the were-rat, and the were-rat I think is one of the most important ones. Now, the way we did it was a little bit different than what the rules said, but I think if you're going to play original Dungeons & Dragons, this makes a lot of sense. The way the rules work for this one is that if you take 50% of your hit points in damage, then you are infected with lycanthropy. Now, the way we did it is the damage you take is a % chance to become a lycanthrope. Now, this would be sort of a cumulative. If you were to fight a werewolf and that fight were to go on for a couple days as it harassed you and all this type of stuff, all these fights would contribute. If you got healed, all the damage you took while healed and through healing would also contribute. We also had that where rats actually did double the %. So if you got hit for 20 points of damage, you'd have a 40% chance of turning into a were-rat versus a werewolf would be 20%. Either way, your character becomes an NPC if this happens. There are also the fact that nature is outright weird sometimes, and they do what they do all the time. So in general, what I'm trying to get at is that there are locations like overcrowded, stagnant, or stale air water areas where magic corruption might be a hotspot for diseases. Now, that magical corruption might actually be a reactor of some sort that's failing, that is causing some sort of craft issues or area around a crash site problems. Or maybe it might just a straight smallpox type of situation in a fantasy historical realm, or you have rats that carry a plague across your countryside. What we do know to be fairly true also when it comes to creatures is creatures that interact with blood, such as ticks and leeches, probably have issues. And those who eat dead things probably have parasite and worms. And those that are cursed, like lycanthropes and mummies, for sure are a problem. Now, when you have things all combining, like giant rats or were-rats, an example, who may deal with all 3, then you really are going to find more diseases mixed in with that. So, how would that play out in the world? Well, for example, If you're dealing with a location that is a cave system that is near something that makes steam, that causes the walls to collect moisture with a raised temperature that is higher than normal, and you run into a room where a battle of bandits got into a fight with something days or weeks ago, and now there's a bunch of decaying bodies on the floor with a host of rodents of all sizes feasting on the dead in the area around it. The rats in the area might actually be a carrier of several diseases that are going to be problems as you wake up, maybe with them nibbling on you, or maybe you wake up and you're one of the few survivors of the bandit fight, and now you have to wonder what's going on. That's kind of how I think this was supposed to be intended, but they don't really get into that. And in 1974, when giant rats are detailed, they didn't put this in any sort of detail. Same thing in Supplement 1 that came out in 1975. They didn't dive into this aspect of giant rats. Now, in later editions, they do actually dive into that. But things like this, I think, are great avenues for a referee to add this to their game. Interestingly, covered in the disease section, though, is the duration, how it can be influenced by a character's constitution, ranging from 1/2 the duration to double the duration, or the recovery would be a great way of wording that. I also feel like something like that is also a lie about care, not just about your constitution. I think it's too complicated of a formula to just kind of put a base stat line out there. I also think that there are certain people who have weaknesses towards a disease, and once you get a disease, you don't necessarily gain immunity to it, but maybe you gain a weakness or have a harder time recovering. Something like tuberculosis might be harder to recover from. This book kind of talks about things in broad strokes and doesn't really get too much into details, while they do name specific names on some things like yellow fever. But you can't say yellow fever reacts the same as typhoid. They just don't. They have very different symptoms, very different actions, and different recovery times. There are some also overarching questions about realism. Where do you want this in the world? Do you want to be on the left or the right of this type of thing? Somewhere in the middle is probably better if you want to include this at all. But for example, if you're wanting to have this in your world, then when you go into a hike, an adventure into a swamp, there is a very real possibility that you're going to leave that swamp fleeing with just your weapon and the clothes on your back, as your strength is so low it sapped everything away from you and you're basically fading in and out of consciousness. Now, while that could be an epic and awesome story, you don't want that run by a book. You want that run by the referee at the table, who's taking everything into consideration and not using arbitrary numbers that were established to give people a base guideline of what's good. I think also stories like that can be epic. You got the butt whooping of a lifetime. You have maybe some scars to prove it, but this needs to be referenced by the referee, as I said already. I think I will have some diseases in my game when I might use things like crud and grip, but I think I'm going to avoid even terms like the flu and colds, because while that could be described, I don't want people to use WebMD or have this come into conflict in the future where you're using modern terms to pull you out of the thing. Now, if I can find the medieval terms like maybe grip, then I probably would use that. But if I were to say that a large portion of the world died due to consumption, you probably wouldn't necessarily know what that means. And then when I describe it, that might be something that might be more interesting to you. And again, there are some mechanics for control to get the paladin out of his plate mill so he or she is not trying to sleep in it all night, and to have some common use for things like crud. It's also a way to make swamps harder to navigate and add some differences between your areas. Having sturges in this area that potentially could give you this disease, and this one over here that potentially has some sort of outbreak, or you go there and there's signs up on the outside of a city saying do not enter, go away, or help, because they have this disease in that city. I think adds a lot of character and a lot of world building. No, we don't want to go there. It's been 10 years since they had the yellow fever and we don't want to be around that, for example. Anyways, guys, did I get this one right? Did I get this wrong? Let me know down in the comments down below. Let me know what you guys think. Thank you. Have a great day. See you guys in the next one. Bye.